But I saw the head, the neck, and the huge body, which I'd say was about 30 feet long.
New sonar evidence may have finally explained the Loch Ness Monster, and the strangest part is who actually cracked it. For 90 years, the best minds dragged million-dollar sonar fleets across this lake and came back with nothing but blurred shapes nobody could agree on.
Loch Ness is not huge on a world scale, but it is in terms of depth, and it was that aspect which attracted me.
Then, a soft-spoken geneticist named Professor Neil Gemmell walks onto the shore in June of 2018, carrying 250 empty bottles. And no interest in monsters, no submarines, no sonar, just water. What he pulls out of it is still being argued about today, and once you hear it, you will never look at this lake the same way again. What broke the legend? For nearly a century, the world believed something ancient was hiding in the dark water of Scotland, a long-necked creature, maybe a surviving dinosaur, maybe a beast older than memory itself. People flew across oceans to catch a glimpse of it. They lined the shoreline with cameras. They booked boats for a single blurry second of footage they could argue about for the rest of their lives. And the serious teams, the funded ones, came with far more than binoculars. Expeditions arrived with million-dollar sonar fleets, towed cameras, and military-grade arrays, sweeping the lake end to end, year after year, certain that this time the machines would finally corner whatever was down there. One after another, they came away with the same thing. Blurred contacts, ambiguous traces, a shape that could be a fish or a log or nothing at all. Nothing you could hold in your hand or lay on a table. The water always won. Gemmell's method was almost insultingly simple by comparison. Every fish, every bird, every mammal, every microbe living in the loch is constantly shedding tiny pieces of itself into the surrounding water. Skin cells, mucus, waste, scales, all of it carrying genetic code. If something is alive in Loch Ness, its DNA is drifting in the water for up to a full day after it passes through. So, he did not need to see the monster. He only needed to filter the bottles, sequence whatever he caught, and compare every fragment against the global database of known life on Earth. He sampled at the surface, at the middle depths, and near the bottom. He covered the northern basin and the southern basin. Roughly 250 samples in total, shipped to laboratories in 3 countries, amplified, read, and cross-referenced against the sequenced code of hundreds of thousands of known organisms. It was a census of every living thing in the lake, taken without ever laying eyes on a single one of them. He did not do it alone. Standing on the shore beside him was a man who had been watching this water since 1973. Adrian Shine, a naturalist with a long gray beard and the patience of a glacier, had spent 5 decades on Loch Ness. He had led the legendary Operation Deep Scan in 1987. He had built the visitor exhibits at the Loch Ness Center. He had watched expedition after expedition arrive certain and leave with nothing. Shine did not expect a monster. He expected, after 50 years, to finally be proven right about what was not here. On the 5th of September, 2019, Gemmell stood at a press conference inside the Loch Ness Center in Drumnadrachit and delivered the verdict the world had waited 90 years to hear. He had identified roughly 3,000 species in his samples. He had run the data against the 4 major theories the public had argued over for decades. The plesiosaur theory, a surviving prehistoric reptile, was dead. No reptilian DNA anywhere in the loch. The giant sturgeon theory was dead. No sturgeon DNA. The Greenland shark theory was dead. No shark DNA. And the giant catfish theory, quietly endorsed by some of the most respected monster hunters in the country, was also dead. No catfish DNA either. 90 years of competing explanations, the 4 ideas that had filled books and documentaries and late-night arguments, eliminated in a single afternoon by the contents of a few plastic bottles. But one species lit up his readings, at every single depth, in every single region of the loch, in concentrations that genuinely surprised him. Eels, European eels, anguilla, they were everywhere. Gemmell had narrowed 90 years of mystery down to a single suspect. But before any of that could mean anything, you have to understand why this lake hid its secrets for so long in the first place. A lake. Unlike any, Loch Ness is not a normal body of water. It is a wound in the surface of the planet, carved by ice along one of the most active tectonic faults in the British Isles. The Great Glen Fault is a 62-mile diagonal slash across the top of Scotland, and the Loch sits directly on top of it. The fault is alive. It produced a magnitude 5.1 earthquake near Inverness in 1816, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake at Dochgarach in 1901 that opened a 500-meter ground crack along the canal towpath, and dozens of smaller tremors that still register every single year. Now, picture the scale of the thing. The lake is 23 miles long. It reaches 755 feet at its deepest point. It holds 7.5 cubic kilometers of fresh water, more than every lake in England and Wales combined. To stand on the shore and try to picture that volume is almost impossible. This is not a pond with a legend attached. It is one of the largest reservoirs of fresh water in Western Europe, stretched into a long, narrow trench so deep the floor sits well below sea level. Below 100 meters, the temperature holds at 5 degrees Celsius all year long, no matter the season above. A heat wave can bake the highlands, and the deep water will not notice. The pressure down there is crushing. The darkness is total. But here is the detail that matters most. The hills around Loch Ness are covered in peat, and rainwater drains through the peat before it ever reaches the lake. The peat releases compounds called humic acids, and those compounds stain the water the color of strong tea. Underwater visibility is often measured in inches. You can submerge your hand on a sunny afternoon and lose sight of your fingers before your wrist gets wet. This is where the title's promise starts to crack open. Sonar systems struggle to interpret returns through this murky stew of dissolved organic material. Cameras are essentially useless. Powerful lights aimed into the depths just scatter and die a few feet from the lens. The lake is, for all practical purposes, opaque. This is why a monster legend could survive here for over a millennium. You cannot see into Loch Ness. You can only see what briefly comes out of it. If you are still here, still turning this over instead of scrolling past, take 1 second to subscribe, because the next part is where the lake stops being scenery and starts being the suspect. There is one more strange property of this water that almost nobody talks about, and it explains more sightings than any creature ever could. The invisible wave. In 1971, and again in 1972, the journal Nature published 2 papers by a researcher named S.A. Thorpe describing a phenomenon called an internal seiche. Adrian Shine has been pointing at it for years, but it almost never makes the documentaries because on paper it sounds boring. On the water, it is anything but. When wind blows down the long, narrow valley that holds Loch Ness, it shoves the warm upper layer of water toward one end of the lake. The warm layer pivots like a tilted plate around the colder layer beneath it. When the wind drops, all the warm water rushes back to find its level, but it overshoots, then rebounds, then overshoots again. The lake sloshes back and forth internally for weeks at a time. You cannot see this from the surface. What you can see is the result. The internal seiche drives slow-moving columns of water along the top of the lake, sometimes against the prevailing breeze. A long, dark hump appears to glide across the water in the wrong direction. There is no boat. There is no wind that explains it. A witness watches it for 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute, and then it dissolves and is gone. No splash, no trail, nothing. Here is the part that gets people. The human brain is built to assume that something moving with purpose is alive. A wave traveling against the wind, on a lake with no visible current, with nothing on the surface to give it scale, reads to the watching mind as intention, as a body, as an animal choosing where to go. The eye reports a creature because the eye has no other box to put it in. Adrian Shine has said, the seiche alone is enough to turn an ordinary afternoon into a Loch Ness Monster, especially when the surface is glassy calm and the brain has nothing to measure against. This is why most credible sightings happen on still days. The Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, which ran continuous watches from 1962 to 1972, came to call those conditions Nessie weather. They knew the patterns matched the seiche. The public never quite caught on. But the seiche is only part of the story, because the lake under your feet is also moving in ways the human eye was never built to detect. The fault that roars. In the year 565, an Irish missionary named Saint Columba was traveling through the highlands. According to a biography written about 100 years later by a monk named Adamnan of Iona, Columba came across a man who had been killed by a water beast in the River Ness, the short river that drains the loch into the Moray Firth. Columba ordered one of his followers to swim across, and when the beast rose to attack, the saint made the sign of the cross and commanded it to retreat. The creature obeyed. For centuries, this was treated as a colorful piece of medieval Christian folklore. A saint, a miracle, nothing more. It is the oldest written account anyone has ever tied to the legend, the seed that documentaries keep returning to as proof that something has lurked here for more than 1,400 years. But in 2014, an Italian geologist named Luigi Picardi noticed something in the original Latin that nobody had flagged. Adamnan describes the beast emerging cum ingenti fremitu, which translates as with loud roaring. Picardi argued that this was never the sound of an animal. It was the sound of an earthquake on the Great Glen Fault, accompanied by a sudden release of gas through the lakebed, producing a violent surface disturbance that medieval observers naturally read as a creature. The oldest evidence for the monster, read carefully, may be the oldest evidence for the fault. This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. The fault under Loch Ness is so active that the modern Kessock Bridge in Inverness was built with 3-meter-long, 2.5-ton hydraulic seismic buffers at its northern abutment, engineered to absorb sudden ground movement. You do not bolt machinery like that onto a bridge over quiet geology. You do it because the ground there is expected to move. And when the Lisbon earthquake struck Portugal in 1755, 1,300 miles away, the shaking reached all the way to Scotland and produced a recorded seiche on Loch Ness. A disaster on the Iberian coast reached across an entire continent and made the surface of this highland lake rise and fall. So now look at what we have: a deep, opaque, peat-stained lake, sloshing internally for weeks at a time, sitting on top of an active geological scar that occasionally vents gas through its floor. Bubbles rise, water roils, surface fronts appear out of nowhere. The fault is constantly whispering to the loch above it. Add one more thing to all of this: an enormous population of slimy, serpentine fish that nobody had properly counted until the year 2019. And suddenly, the witnesses start to make a lot more sense. The eels were always there. European eels begin their lives in the Sargasso Sea, somewhere between Bermuda and the Caribbean. The larvae drift on the Gulf Stream for 7 to 11 months before reaching European coasts as transparent glass eels. They migrate up rivers as elvers and settle into freshwater lakes for anywhere between 6 and 20 years, sometimes far longer. When the time finally comes to spawn, they transform into silver eels, swim back down their rivers, cross 6,000 kilometers of open Atlantic, and die after laying their eggs in the same warm sea where they were born. Most of them, not all of them. Some never go. Some stay in the freshwater they grew up in, never breeding, never triggering the final transformation that ends the life of every eel that does. They just keep eating, they keep growing, and because they never spend the enormous energy of reproduction, they can keep doing it for an astonishingly long time. There is a Swedish eel that made this famous. In 1859, an 8-year-old boy dropped it into a well in the village of Brantevik. It was found dead at the bottom of that same well on the 7th of August, 2014. If the dating holds, that eel had lived 155 years. Experts have called the figure plausible but unverified, since the bones needed to confirm the age were lost during retrieval. It was only 53 centimeters long when it died, with abnormally enlarged eyes from a lifetime in the dark. Small, ancient, almost blind. That is what a stay-behind eel becomes. Now, think about where Loch Ness sits in that picture. Constant cold. An endless food supply of salmon and trout. No natural predator large enough to threaten a full-grown adult. It is exactly the kind of place a stay-behind eel could survive for an extraordinarily long time and grow the entire while. Gemmell's data never measured the size of the eels in the loch. It only confirmed there were a lot of them. But when reporters pushed him, he said the line that reopened everything. A 4-meter eel would be well outside the normal range. He could not rule it out. A statistical paper published in 2023 by Flo Foxon in the journal JMIRX Bio used historical catch data to estimate the odds of finding a 1-meter eel in Loch Ness at roughly 1 in 50,000. Possible, but rare. the chance of finding anything significantly larger drops towards 0. That is the nuance the headlines flattened. The eDNA did not prove a giant eel exists. It proved that eels dominate this lake, and that the far upper tail of their size range, while wildly unlikely to reach monster proportions, was never mathematically impossible. So, the giant eel theory is not a guaranteed answer. It is a strong candidate that fits much of the eyewitness pattern, especially every description of a long, undulating, serpentine body moving just below the surface. An eel breaking that tea-colored water, with no reference for scale, looks far longer and far stranger than it is. But not everyone accepts Gemmell's conclusion. The loudest objection comes from the one man who has spent more time staring at this lake than anyone alive. The quietest agreement comes from the man who was standing next to Gemmell on the shore. 2 lifetimes on the same water, 2 answers that could not be further apart. 2 men, 1 lake. In 1991, a 28-year-old man from Dorset named Steve Feltham sold his house, quit his job, ended his relationship, and drove 600 miles north to live in a converted mobile library van on Doris Beach. He never left. Today he holds the Guinness World Record for the longest continuous Loch Ness Monster vigil in history, more than 33 years and counting. He sells small clay Nessie figurines to tourists to feed himself, and he watches the water every single day with the same pair of binoculars he carried up from home. 3 decades of weather, 3 decades of seasons. 1 man, 1 strip of shoreline, and a question he refused to put down even after most of the world stopped asking it. In July of 2015, after 24 years of full-time watching, Feltham announced his answer. He believed the Loch Ness Monster was a Wells catfish, a freshwater giant native to continental Europe, capable of reaching nearly 9 feet. Victorian aristocrats had stocked British lakes with them in the late 1800s for sport, and Feltham worked out that the population would have been hitting maturity right around the Aldie Mackay sighting in 1933, the surge of George Spicer reports, and the famous surgeon's photograph of 1934. The catfish, he said, ticked most of the boxes from eyewitness accounts, even if it did not tick all of them. Then Gemmell's eDNA results came back in 2019 with 0 catfish DNA. Not low. 0. The one piece of hard genetic evidence anyone had ever produced landed directly on Feltham's theory and flattened it. He did not fold. In a Saga magazine interview in 2023, he was still calling the catfish his front runner, arguing that a small surviving population could explain the dwindling rate of modern sightings without leaving enough genetic trace to be caught. 30 years in a van on the beach does not end because a laboratory says so. Adrian Shine reached the opposite conclusion, and he reached it without raising his voice. After 50-plus years on the Loch, Shine believes the overwhelming majority of sightings are boat wakes, internal seiches, swans, otters, and water birds with their long, elegant necks. He has said it plainly. There are indeed long-necked creatures on Loch Ness, and we call them swans. Any large unexplained sonar contact, he believes, is most likely a seal that wandered in from the sea through the River Ness. No monster. Just a lake doing what this lake does, watched by people primed to see something more. 2 men, the same lake. One still living in a van on the beach, binoculars up, hunting. One who long ago made his peace with the absence of a monster. Both gave their entire adult lives to a single question and walked away holding opposite answers. And here is the part that should bother you. Neither of them is fully wrong. What Nessie really is. The honest answer is the one nobody wanted, because it is stranger and bigger than either side's tidy version. The Loch Ness Monster is not one thing. It is 5 forces working on the same body of water at the same moment. The first is biological. A thriving population of European eels, almost certainly including some unusually large individuals, moving with exactly the serpentine motion the most credible eyewitness sketches describe. The second is hydrodynamic. Internal sea waves dragging slow surface humps across the lake for weeks after every windstorm, often against the breeze in ways that defy ordinary intuition. The third is geological. The Great Glen Fault venting gas, throwing microquakes, and disturbing the surface in ways that have been mistaken for living creatures since at least the year 565. The fourth is optical. peat-stained water with visibility of inches, making depth and scale impossible to judge, especially on calm days when the surface turns into a black mirror. The fifth is cultural. Once Alex Campbell printed the word monster in the Inverness Courier on the 2nd of May, 1933, every ripple, log, deer, salmon, otter, and trick of light became a candidate for something extraordinary. The word itself changed what people saw. Before the story had a name, a strange shape on the water was just a strange shape on the water. After, the same shape was a sighting, reported, recorded, retold, added to the weight of everything that came before. The numbers show exactly that drift. Gary Campbell, who kept the official Loch Ness sightings register from 1996 until handing it to his daughter, Paige Daly, in 2024, logged over 1,100 sightings across his tenure. 2023 saw 10 accepted reports. The first half of 2024 produced just one. The creature is not going extinct. It is being out-resolved. Every tourist now carries a high-definition camera in their pocket, and the humps almost always turn out to be waves. And yet, the title's promise has not been emptied out. A few sonar threads still refuse to disappear. During Operation Deep Scan in October of 1987, Adrian Shine put a line of boats across the full width of the loch, every one of them running sonar at once, and swept the lake like a net being dragged through it. 3 times the screens registered something solid in midwater, all larger than a shark and smaller than a whale, all at depths where there should have been nothing of that size. The boats turned to come back for a second pass. By the time they returned, all 3 contacts were gone. They have never been accounted for. Then there is the roughly 20% of Gemmell's DNA reads that matched no known species. Sitting in the data, almost certainly unmapped microbial fragments, but technically still unidentified. And during the Quest expedition of 2024, Alan McKenna's hydrophone captured a rhythmic pulsing recording, a sound he says he had never heard before in any of his recordings, and it has still not been explained. None of these alone proves a creature, but none of them has been closed either. And that is exactly the kind of gap a legend lives inside. The mystery has not been deleted. It has been narrowed dramatically. There is no plesiosaur. There is no surviving prehistoric reptile. There is no giant unknown species waiting at the bottom of the lake. The chemistry, the biology, and the genetics have all closed those doors and locked them. But the loch itself, the dark, cold, peat-stained, fault-straddling, eel-filled, siege-driven, gas-releasing crack in the Earth's crust, is still producing its own monsters. It produces one every time someone parks at the 7 Mile Stone, looks at the water, and feels something move at the edge of their vision. It always will. The legend was never just a lie told by hoaxers, though there were hoaxers. It was never a single hidden animal, though people gave their lives searching for one. It was a lake so unusual that it manufactures the experience of a monster on demand, for anyone standing on the right shore, on the right kind of still gray afternoon. The Loch Ness Monster turned out to be real. It was just nothing anybody expected. It was the lake itself. So after all of it, the sonar, the DNA, the fault, the eels, the waves, what do you actually think is down there? Tell us in the comments whether you believe science has finally closed the case, or whether something is still waiting in that dark water the bottles never caught. And if you want the next mystery, the machines are quietly rewriting, the one about the rhythmic sound under the ice that nobody has been able to identify yet. Subscribe now so the algorithm actually shows it to you, because that story is coming next, and you do not want to find out about it secondhand.